Good morning. On Sunday, March 10th, right? That's 2 weeks from now at 11:30 a.m., I need every high schooler in our church. So if you're in here and you're in high school, or maybe your high schooler doesn't attend regularly, just hit and miss, on Sunday, March 10th, that's daylight saving weekend, I'm gonna speak to the high schoolers at 11:30 a.m. and a couple things that I feel like every high schooler needs to know. And so that's the big announcement I have for you is do not miss that weekend if you're in high school. Are you ready to jump in today? Yes. All right, that's a really convincing answer there. Christmas Eve, 1971, there's a 17-year-old young lady by the name of Julianne Kupka who boards a flight from one side of Peru to the other. And she boards the plane with about 90 other passengers, including her mom. And not long after the plane takes off, it gets caught up in a thunderstorm above the Amazon rainforest. Well, it's not that big of a deal, right? There's thunder, there's lightning, there's some turbulence, but then it starts to get worse and worse, and eventually people are panicking, some people are crying, some people start to scream, and then lightning hits the plane, and it starts to disintegrate in the air. Pieces are falling off, and the plane starts to dive 2 miles towards the ground. Well, while it's in this dive towards the ground, a row of seats ends up detaching from the plane. And Julianne is on that row of seats, and so she's plummeting to the ground, and she passes out. And before I say anything else, I know this sounds like a Netflix series, right? But it's absolutely a true story. The plane crashes, everybody dies, but Julianne is alive. And she's passed out, but when she wakes up and comes to, she realizes, oh my gosh, I've been in a plane crash. She's alone, she's strapped to her seat, and it's pouring rain, so she gets underneath the seat to protect her from the rain, and she realizes, okay, that can't continue forever. Eventually I gotta come out, but she has cuts, she has bruises, she has a concussion, broken collarbone, but shockingly, other than that, her injuries are pretty minor. And so after coming out from this row of seats that she's been hiding under to protect her from the rain, she looks around and realizes she doesn't have a clue where she's at. She doesn't know if she's still in Peru. She doesn't know what area of Peru, if she's still there. She's very confused, very disoriented, and she's scared. Thankfully for her, she had been raised in the jungle, at least around it. Her father was a zoologist, her mother was a scientist, and so they spent large amounts of time in and around the rainforest studying wildlife. And so here's Julianne in the midst of a very terrifying experience, and she was able to think clearly enough to remember her father had told her 2 things about if you ever find yourself lost in a rainforest. The first thing he said is, if you go downhill usually leads to water, and water usually leads to civilization. And so she was able to, in the midst of this very disorienting time, gain her bearings enough to follow that advice. She starts walking, she's got a torn mini dress, just one sandal, she's in, she walks downhill, she finds a creek. Sure enough, she stays with that creek long enough that it connects to a river. And then she stays along that river, and she says, I wasn't actually in that much pain. I wasn't actually that scared or panicked, but over the course of several days, I started to lose hope. And then after 11 days in the forest, 11 days in the jungle, she walks out into civilization. And it was this incredible moment, and everybody is celebrating. And I'm just amazed at her resilience. I've had several people at Timberlake who learned that I like to hike, and they told me about Mailbox Peak, right? And I've looked, and it's a difficult hike, and it's not for the faint of heart, and so I have not yet tried it. But she's 17 years old and survives 11 days in the jungle. And she survived by holding on to these 2 principles. Downhill leads to water, and water leads to people. It's the reason she's still alive today. If she didn't have some guiding principles, she would have gotten lost. She would have drifted probably farther and farther into the forest. And I tell you this story because in many ways, we are living in very disorienting times. We're living in this world in which culture and philosophies and worldviews are surrounding us at every turn, and it just feels like one big jungle that's easy to get lost in. You know this, every segment of society seems to be becoming more and more polarized. Everybody has expectations of everybody else. Sometimes they're verbalized and other times they're not even spoken, but the expectations are still there. There's constant pressure to speak up or to take a stand on various issues. If you try to do that and you take a stand, or maybe you think this is something I shouldn't take a stand on, and especially if you're a leader, it's very possible you're not gonna get a second chance because your mistakes will live forever on the internet. Social media has given everyone a voice and everybody uses their voice to shout. And then to complicate things, every year somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million books are published in the United States. Some of them are self-published and others of them are published by the publishing companies, but every one of those books conveys some sort of worldview. We are living in very disorienting times, and it seems like everywhere we look, there's a thought, there's a belief, there's an opinion, there's a worldview saying this is the right way, this is the direction, you need to walk over here. And so the answer that the Church of Jesus Christ has to answer at some point is, how do we ensure we don't get lost in the jungle of life and culture and information? How do we at Timberlake ensure we don't lose our way? That we don't drift, that we stay on course? Well, that's why we're doing this teaching series. We started last week and we'll end next week. But we started this teaching series, and last week we talked a little bit about this. We talked about the importance of our mission and being guided by our mission. And if you weren't here last week, our mission is very straightforward. It is to help people find and follow Jesus. And I don't do this all the time, but I'm gonna say this. If you missed last week and you did not watch online, you need to go back and watch it. It is gonna be one of the defining talks for who we are as a church. And we explain so much of why we do what we do. But this right here is why we do it, right? That's why we exist. And ever since we launched in the fall of 1989, we've had this passion that's driving us. We wanna help people find and follow Jesus. But if we're not careful, we're going to drift. If we're not careful, we're going to get distracted because there are lots of distractions. Right? We're in this jungle and everybody's saying, this is the way, try this, do this. Our world's constantly evolving and changing. I mean, just think, since 1989, how much this world has changed. Right, 34 years ago, the World Wide Web did not exist. Nobody had smartphones, there wasn't social media, blockchain technology hadn't been introduced. Several nations, right, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, they were on the map, but today they no longer exist in that form. And our world is always going to evolve, it's always gonna change. And right now, it seems to be at an exponential rate. And so we have to guard ourselves from not losing our focus, right? So we have to guard ourselves to ensure we don't drift. Because it's easy to drift. And 2,000 years ago, that's exactly what happened to some of the very first churches that ever got started. They drifted. And we know this because John, who was one of the disciples of Jesus, writes about these churches and some of the drift that was happening. And what I'm gonna do in just a moment is I'm gonna summarize what he wrote, but first I wanna give you some context. The disciple John, his life had been impacted by Jesus in a significant way. Obviously, he had seen miracles, he had heard Jesus teach, he watched the interactions. He was so impacted by Jesus that until his final days on this planet, he was telling as many people as he could about the impact Jesus could make. Anyone who would listen, he would tell them about Jesus. And eventually, the Roman Emperor Domitian, he determines that John is a nuisance. And he wants to minimize John's influence in the spread of the Christian faith. And so what he does is he exiles John to the island of Patmos. Now, at the time, John is an older man. It had been 65 years since the resurrection of Jesus. And so John is now banished to this island. And while he's there, he has a vision. This is a supernatural experience. This isn't something John claimed to have had every day. This was a very specific vision. And in this vision, he receives a specific message for 7 different churches. All right, so here on this map is Patmos. This is where the island that John was living on. And the message he receives are for these 7 churches in Asia Minor, which today is Turkey. And he writes down those messages in a book that's become known to us as the book of Revelation. It's in our Bible. And these churches that he writes to, they're churches we can relate to because they're churches that are a few decades old and they're starting to drift. One of the churches had lost their joy. And so he says to them, the message for you is you need to refocus your hearts on God. There was another church, they were experiencing all types of persecution. He says, hey, you need to be careful. You need to stay faithful in the midst of this. There was another church, they loved Jesus, but they were very open-minded to new doctrines, and they were chasing religious fads and different philosophies, and his message to them was, don't be deceived. There was another church, and the message he had for them is, you have a reputation for loving people and serving people, but here's the deal. You're very tolerant of sin. There's a lot of sexual immorality that is unfolding in your church, so you need to stop tolerating sin. There's another church that had a great reputation, lots of influence, they had nice buildings, they had engaging services, but spiritually, they were asleep. And it says, you need to wake up. There's a church going through difficult times, and he says, what you need to do in these difficult times is you need to stay focused, you need to hold on to your faith. There was another church that was being distracted with riches and pleasure and success, and the message to them was, you need to watch out for indifference. It's easy for churches to start out strong, focused on their mission, and then without even meaning to, start to drift over time. And the reason it's so common is because we don't have to work at drift. Right? We don't have to be intentional. I don't have to have strategy meetings on how do we drift from our mission. You don't have to do that. You just naturally, just lose focus, get caught up in things you shouldn't be getting caught up in, start accepting new doctrines, you start believing new things, and then you drift. Now, full disclosure, everything I talk about at Timberlake Church, I'm pretty passionate about, right? I don't speak about something that personally isn't burning inside of me, but this particular message burns at a different level. And it's because 16 years ago, I was on staff at a church that was absolutely on mission. One of the fastest growing churches in the country, making a huge difference. Lives were being changed, families impacted, churches were being started. And the church was filled with amazing people, great leaders, people who love God, people who are generous with their time and their energy and their resources. It was a defining moment in my life. I absolutely loved being on staff. And then I left and I went and started a church in Wisconsin. And from across the country, I watched from a distance as this church that I love so deeply started to move off mission. They started to drift. Today, they no longer exist. Thousands of people, millions of dollars in resources, blessing the world, starting churches, helping people. Today, they're gone. Because at some point, the church leadership started to drift and they started to get lost and disoriented in the jungle of life and culture and philosophies and worldviews. And I certainly don't want to shame them. These are people I love. But my question is, how do we ensure that doesn't happen to us? How do we ensure we don't go off mission? How do we ensure we don't get lost in the chaos of this world? Well, some of our staff and some of our leadership team has spent the last several months talking about this exact issue. And what we've done is we've clarified 5 core values that in many ways are like trail markers for us at Timberlake to ensure that we're still on course, that we're moving in the right direction. Now, churches obviously have a lot in common with each other, right? Churches teach from the scriptures, they point to Jesus. There's just so much that churches have in common. But each church does have its own thumbprint, its own fingerprint, its own voice print. So just like every human is unique, every church is unique, and that's why different churches are used by God to reach different types of people. And what makes us unique as a church are the 5 core values that we're going to be talking about for the next 2 weeks. Now, it's not that other churches do not share some of these values, so don't hear me say that. But I will say that every church has a different priority in how they value things. Every church focuses on different things, they care about different things, and I think that's the way God intended it. Now, there are some things that God wants us all to care about, no doubt about it, but there are churches that have unique focuses. Again, different churches to reach different types of people. So over the next 2 weeks, we're gonna talk about these 5 core values. Today, we're only gonna talk about the first 2. And I'm gonna spend the bulk of our time talking about the first one. So if you're looking at your notes and you're like, dear God, is this guy ever gonna shut up? The answer is, we'll still get out of here on time, all right? Next week, we'll talk about the remaining 3, this week, the first 2. So if you don't join us in person next week, catch up online. But these 5 core values are so important to who we are at Timberlake Church that if we ever stop placing emphasis on them, if they ever stop being a priority, we'll just look like a very different church. We'll have gotten off course, we'll have drifted from our mission. And so this first one that we're gonna spend a lot of time on, if you've been around for a while, I'm sure you've heard us say this before, maybe in different words and maybe this exact phrase, but one of the things that makes Timberlake Church unique is we're committed to this. We are a life-giving, biblically faithful church. Well, shouldn't all churches be like that? Well, I think so. Life-giving is a church that is focused on grace. Biblically faithful would be a church that's focused on truth. But we know this. There's a lot of churches, they focus a lot on grace, Everybody's accepted. Everybody just come as you are. This is great. No perfect people allowed, right? We have all these cute phrases. But they don't emphasize truth. And there are other churches, man, the Bible said it, I believe it, and it's true, right? Go change your life. Get right with God, right? And there's truth, but there's no grace. And we want to have both. A life-giving church is a church that's marked by grace. Grace is when you give something to someone that they do not deserve. It's when you extend unconditional love and acceptance to another human being. When someone is a person of grace, we love to be around that person. Right? The person is just lavish in grace, always accepting. They're easygoing. They accept us for who we are. They don't make demands of us. They're always welcoming. They cut us a lot of slack. Those are the people. I don't care who you are. I don't care what your background. We love to be around people of grace. And one of the many things we learn about God through the life and teachings of Jesus and through the teachings of the ancient scriptures is that God was full of grace. He's lavish in his grace, pouring out grace upon grace upon grace. I mean, it's just core to who he is. And because that's what God is like towards us, we want to be like that towards others. We want a reputation that at Timberlake Church, they forgive people who don't even deserve forgiveness. They forgive people who don't even ask for forgiveness. They're a church of mercy. They're a church of love. They're a church that's just generous to people who can never pay them back. That's the reputation we want. We want to be a church that's marked by grace. At the same time, we want to be a church that's marked by truth. Now, truth is a description of whatever is real. Truth describes how things really are. When you get around a person of truth, it's obvious because these are people with core convictions and principles that they operate their life by. It is right and wrong, right? They just see the world in those kind of terms. They speak out against injustice and oppression and evil. They live by a set of standards for their own life. They don't minimize or downplay reality. They're people, when they say something, you can trust them because they are people of truth and people who are principled. And at Timberlake Church, we want to be a church that's marked by grace, but we also want to be marked by truth because we need both. And the challenge is that all of us, based on our personality, our upbringing, our temperament, have a tendency to gravitate strongly towards one or the other. It's very likely that if you grew up in a home with two parents, that one of them was a grace parent and the other was the truth parent. In my house, there's no debate. I'm the truth parent. I'm about boundaries. I'm about principles. I'm about raising young men and young women, right? That's just say, hey, I want you to be fully responsible by the time you're an adult. You need to get a job. They all had jobs in their, in their early teens. Like, that's a big deal for me. My wife, oh, dear God. Grace upon grace upon grace. I'm trying to raise my kids to be independent and well-rounded people. My wife is trying her best to undermine that goal. A few years ago, my daughter, Caitlin, when she was attending the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, she came to me one day and she said, Dad, I need you to co-sign a loan for me. That's the only way I'm gonna finish college. I said, ain't gonna happen. Well, why isn't it gonna happen? Because I know you and you are getting a degree in partying right now. That's what your degree's in. So I'm not gonna help you, I'm not gonna enable you. And so we got in this argument about it and finally she dropped it. A couple months later, I learned that after I said no, she went to Mama Bear. She said to my wife, will you please co-sign the loan? And my wife co-signed it for her. So I asked my wife when this happened, I said, why didn't you ask me? She just said, well, it's our daughter. I assume we were gonna help. I said, all right, well how much is the loan for? I don't know. What is the interest rate on the loan? I don't know. When do we have to start paying it? I don't know. What are the contracts? I don't know. If you're here today and you're in need of a co-signer for your home, talk to my wife in the lobby. Guys, most of us are drawn to people of grace. We're drawn to them. About a year ago, I'm not making this up. My family, we're out for dinner, and I say to my oldest daughter, Caitlin, who the loan was co-signed for, I said, hey, Caitlin, what's the thing you like most about your mom? And she goes, Dad, I'm not exaggerating. I'm not trying to be funny. I don't know of one thing Mom has ever done wrong. She is like an angel. And then my other daughter's like, I agree. And then my son, I agree. I'm like, are you kidding me right now? You wanna know why you guys have structure? You wanna know why you guys discipline? You wanna know why you have a house to live in, right? But she's the one who does nothing wrong, right? But we all need grace and truth. And if you think about it, in church environments, truth without grace is poison. It kills the church. Truth without grace is harsh, it's mean, it's judgmental. It's crushing. And unfortunately, I mean, this is often the reputation the church has for whatever reason. Truth without grace tells you you're falling short, you're not measuring up, you're separated from God. On the flip side, grace without truth is very dangerous. Grace without truth leads to something called relativism, where all beliefs are treated as equally valid. In relativism, every individual, every church or every culture gets to determine its own truth. The attitude is, well, you do you. Grace tells you that you're loved and accepted no matter what you do, but it doesn't warn you of the consequences of your actions if you keep it's going in the same direction. So I'm gonna say it again, it's very easy, based on our temperaments and personality, to gravitate one way or the other. But at Timberlake Church, what we wanna do is we wanna embody both, because that's what Jesus did. And we just believe that when truth and grace are extended over an extended period of time in someone's life, it leads to life change. Very few people ever really change overnight, right? It's this process of people just walking alongside of us, being patient. The disciple John, who is the same guy who wrote the book of Revelation, he wrote another manuscript documenting the life and teachings of Jesus. And that manuscript's in our Bible. It's known as the book of John. And at the start of John's book, he uses a very interesting term to refer to the God of this universe. He uses the term, the word. And the Greek word that is being used is the word logos. It means logic and reasoning. And this term was used by ancient Jews or ancient Greeks to convey the idea that the world is governed by a universal intelligence. And so John uses this term, the word or God or the ultimate source of logic and reasoning, at the start of what he writes about Jesus. And here's what he writes. He says, the word, God, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So he's talking about Jesus. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, we just talked about these two words, right? They're very, very different from each other. Grace says you're forgiven. Truth says, well, you need to be held accountable. Grace says you're fine just the way you are. Truth says, well, you're broken. Grace says it's gonna be okay. Truth says you're in trouble. Grace says, I love you no matter what you do. Truth says, you need to take responsibility for what you did. Grace and truth. Right? And you see it in conversation. In fact, this past week, I said to Pastor Kevin, who's our care pastor here, I said, Kevin, my haircut was a little bit shorter than I was intending it. He goes, yeah, it kind of looks like you're in the military. That's truth. And then he says, don't worry, it'll grow back over time. That's grace. Right? When these two words are put together, it creates tension. And it's hard for us because we lean one way or the other. But John writes in his manuscript, after spending years of my life with Jesus, after watching him interact with people, after seeing how he responded to the questions that were asked, I realized that he was both grace and truth. See, if he was just truth, here's what's wrong with you. You're never gonna measure up. God is upset with you. You're distant from God. Your behavior is making God mad. That's not gonna draw people. That isn't life change. But if he's just, come as you are, everybody's accepted, doesn't matter what you do, you're good, there's not life change. But when you put together grace and truth, what happens? All of a sudden, there's a light. All of a sudden, it's illuminated. All of a sudden, right, Jesus is the light of the world. There's something that happens. There's life change that begins to occur. And this is why when we study the life and teachings of Jesus, if we just see it through that filter and through that lens, we'll realize this happened all the time. There was grace, and there was truth, over and over and over again. Truth without grace, that's mean. Grace without truth is meaningless. But when you put grace and truth together, it's like medicine. Change happens. When it comes to something I'm doing wrong, guess what? I want grace. When it comes to something you're doing wrong, I want truth. And John says, I spent years of my life with Jesus, and he was filled to the brim. I'm telling you, filled to the brim with both grace and truth. He goes on to explain. He says, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. The law of Moses was all about rules. It was all about expectations. It was all about laws. Here's what God expects of you. And if you fall short of what God expects from you, you're in trouble. The law says, thou shalt not do these things. And if you do these things, you must go to the temple, you must bring a sacrifice and atone for your sin or wrongdoing. And John says the law was given through Moses, but then he makes this huge distinction. He says that truth and grace come through Jesus. He doesn't indicate that Jesus is a balance between grace and truth, but rather the full embodiment of both. Which means in all of Jesus' teachings, in all of his interactions, in all of his responses to people, we see grace and truth. And it's what made Jesus unpredictable. And it's why Jesus was so confusing to so many people. I mean, we just, again, read through the stories with that lens. We see they're always present. There's a painting from the 1600s that portrays Jesus with a woman, and it comes from a story in which we read about Jesus having an interaction with a woman from Samaria. She's known as the Samaritan woman. And she's shocked that Jesus is talking to her because Jews did not interact with Samaritans. They saw Samaritans as half-breeds. They were half Jewish, half Gentile. They also, when it came to their faith, they embraced some of Judaism, but then some other things. So there was kind of this mix and match. And so they didn't interact, but Jesus is interacting, and she's shocked. And he's talking to her, and he's valuing her. And he asks her for water, and they just get in this conversation. And then after she just feels so loved and so accepted by him, and the interaction's going well, Jesus says to her, now I want you to go get your husband. And she says, I'm not married. And Jesus says, well, that's true, you're not married. You've had 5 husbands, and the guy you're living with right now is someone you're not married to. And even though this woman is a Samaritan, has different beliefs culturally and religiously, she knows that she has been a failure at relationships, and yet Jesus reaches into this darkest, shameful part of her life, and he just calls it out. And then he explains to her, I want you to know who you're talking to. He hadn't said this to anybody else before. So he's just making it clear for the first time to someone who he shouldn't even be talking to. He says, I am the Messiah. I can give you water that will quench the thirst of your soul in a way that no man will ever be able to. Guys, every single interaction with Jesus was like this. He was full of grace. He's talking to someone he shouldn't even be talking to. He's engaging with someone he shouldn't even be engaging with. He's telling her, man, I can help you, but he's also full of truth. He's saying, hey, you've had 5 husbands. You're failing at this relationship thing. The person you're with now, you're not even married to. Over and over and over, grace and truth, grace and truth, grace and truth. We see it in every story we come across. There's a painting from the 1600s, another painting from the 1600s referred to as the Calling of St. Matthew. And it portrays Jesus with these guys known as tax collectors, and he's inviting Matthew to be his disciple. Now in first century Jewish society, tax collectors were about as low as it gets because they worked for the Roman government collecting taxes from their own people. But not only did they collect taxes from them, they exaggerated what was owed, and so they stole money from their own people. Nobody liked tax collectors. And so Jesus says, hey, Matthew, I know you're a tax collector. I want you to follow me. I want you to be a disciple. And so Matthew agrees, and he decides to be one of the disciples of Jesus. And not long after, Matthew throws a party at his house, and he invites a bunch of tax collectors and people with bad reputations, and he has them at his house, and the religious leaders are standing around there. It's like, why would Jesus hang out with these people? And Jesus looks at these religious leaders and says, let me be clear. It's not the healthy people who need a doctor. It's those who are sick. Well, what's happening here? Well, Jesus is hanging out with people that nobody else wanted to associate with. He wasn't worried about his reputation. He wasn't worried about what people thought about him. But you notice he doesn't back down. He calls them sick, spiritually sick. He says, it's not those who think they are righteous that need help. It's those who know they are sinners. Jesus was filled with both grace and truth. Over and over and over, we see these interactions. Here's a painting from the 1800s. It's one of the most famous stories surrounding Jesus. It's a story that reflects the time that Jewish religious leaders found a woman in the very act of adultery. She was caught in the very act. They take her to Jesus, they throw her down and say, according to the law of Moses, she needs to be killed. She needs to be stoned to death. So Jesus, what do you think should happen? And Jesus looks at these religious leaders and he says, all right, well, whoever's without sin, you cast the first stone. And it's this awkward moment, and one by one, these guys are dropping the rocks and the stones that they came with, and they walk away, and then Jesus is left alone with this woman, and he says, hey, where are the people who condemn you? Where are your accusers? And she says, they're not here. And he says, okay, so here's what you need to know. I don't condemn you either. Now go and sin no more. Where are the people that condemn you? I don't condemn you. But go and sin no more. Both are needed. And may our church be an embodiment of both. Both together, grace and truth over time leads to life change. And I could go on and on and on. The point I'm trying to make is this is what Jesus embodied. And we are at our best when we embrace both grace and truth and refuse to let go of the tension. And it's not easy to let go because I'm just telling you, as a pastor, I feel constantly lost in the jungle of culture and philosophies and worldviews. It's not gonna shock you. There are some people who want me to be the truth guy and stand up here every single week and beat you over the head with scripture and tell you, this is what God says, and you're not living up to it and you're falling short. And there's other people who just want me to be the grace guy. Everybody's here, loved, accepted, doesn't matter how you live. Jesus did both. When it came to wrongdoing, when it came to evil, he had no problem, he called it sin. And he makes it clear, sin has consequences. And he says, because there's a consequence, you need to bring a sacrifice. But then he says, but here's the deal, I'm gonna be the sacrifice. That was what his death on the cross was all about. And whatever our sin is today, because you have sin, I have sin, right? It's infiltrated our lives. He says to us, I don't condemn you, but go and sin no more. And if you don't, I love you. And if you struggle trying to stop and it just seems like on again, off again relationship with sin, I love you. And if the shrapnel of your own sin has left you in a place where you're not even sure you'll be able to walk away from the complexity of what you've done, I love you. And if someone has sinned against you and that sin has sent you into a spiral of self-destructive behavior that you're not sure you're ever gonna recover from, I love you. Truth says you're a sinner. Grace says, I don't condemn you. And there is a tension in that. It's messy. And if we ever try to resolve the tension, we will miss so much of what Jesus has intended for us. We can't give up truth because the truth is sin really does have consequences, and because God is love, he wants to protect us from those consequences. We can't avoid truth. And it's the reason why every single week I stand up here and I make it clear, here's how you're supposed to live. Don't lie, don't steal, right? Treat people the way you want to be treated. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God with your heart and soul and mind and strength. Just so you know, sin does have consequences. We don't avoid truth. We can't avoid truth. At the same time, we cannot avoid grace because sin has already made its way into our lives. We're already experiencing the consequences. The reason we feel distant from God so many seasons of our life is because of sin. And grace is our only way back to God, and so we need both grace and truth. And Jesus was the embodiment of both. And if we want to be the best expression of Jesus on this planet, we have to be comfortable with the mess and the unfairness and the inconsistency and all the stuff that goes with managing and hanging on to the tension around grace and truth. As we navigate the jungle of life and culture and worldviews and philosophies and everything we're bombarded with, one of the things that guides us as a church is this commitment to be life-giving but also biblically faithful. Now, I already told you we're not gonna spend near as much time on this second one, but there is a second trail marker, so to speak. There is another value that guides us as a church, and it is the commitment we have to the uncommitted. We talked about this last week in a lot of detail. If you weren't here last week, it's because you're uncommitted. The uncommitted are those who are far from God. It's those who are deconstructing their faith. It's those who are on a spiritual journey and just trying to figure out what they believe about God. It's maybe those who believe in Jesus, but just kind of on again, off again, and following him, and they just feel like it's almost impossible to be consistent. And when we read about the life and teachings of Jesus, it's incredibly clear that Jesus was committed to the uncommitted. He was committed to those lost in the jungle of life and culture and worldviews and philosophies. And there was a first century doctor named Luke who documented the life and teachings of Jesus. And in his manuscript, he tells a story that's portrayed in this painting from the 1600s. He says that Jesus is teaching, and Jesus talks about a shepherd with 100 sheep, and one of them wanders off. And he says the shepherd leaves the 99, and he desperately goes through the wilderness trying to find the sheep. And once he finds it, he picks it up and he puts it around his shoulders and he brings it back and he puts it into the fold. And he says when he tells his friends and family later on that everybody rejoices, and then he helps his audience connect the dots. He says this, he says, in the same way, there is more joy in heaven over one lost sinner who repents and returns to God than over 99 others who are righteous and haven't strayed away. At Timberlake Church, we want to be a church that focuses on grace and truth, but we also want to be a church that is known for having a commitment to the uncommitted. To focus on the one even over the 99. Because when someone surrenders their life to Jesus, the potential for a ripple effect is huge. A ripple effect that impacts children and spouses and family members and extended family and coworkers and friends. And this is the reason we work really, really hard to create environments where people are able to show up and feel safe exploring the claims of Jesus. And we talked last week about how we do this, right? It's the reason we send out mailers and invites multiple times a year, because we want this community to know, we want the East Side to know there is a place, if you want to explore the claims of Jesus, to come and do that in a safe environment. It's the reason why when we read verses from the Bible, we don't assume that everybody knows where to find things in the Bible, so we put verses on the screen. It's why when we sing songs, we try to have words that make sense. It's why we have fun weekends for our kids, right? Our philosophy is we're gonna give kids what they want, so we have an opportunity to give them what they need, which is Jesus. So what do? We have Super Mario weekend and Bluey weekend. I showed up on Bluey weekend. I don't have young kids. I was like, what is Bluey? What is Bluey? I've never heard of Bluey. Right? We have upcoming Squishmallow weekend. We have several weeks ago, we had Rubber Ducky weekend. I didn't even know that. But while I'm trying to speak, someone's in the front row with a kid. I'm like, what is going on? Don't give these things away anymore, right? We do special events and barbecues to allow people to connect. Why? Because of a commitment to the uncommitted. The reason we go out of our way at Christmas and Easter is we know it's the one time that people are most open to respond to the message of Jesus. So we do everything we can to create environments for that to happen. We give away food. Why? It puts people at ease. We show videos of how Jesus changes lives. Last week I talked about how at all of our campuses, all of our services, we're getting rid of our offering buckets. We're eliminating them. Why? Because we know that this stereotype is that the church just wants your money. And obviously it takes a lot of resources to do what we do. And so we just trust your ongoing faithful giving. You can give online. You can give in our giving stations throughout the building. But we're doing this because of a commitment to the uncommitted. We meet people where they're at. And at the end of the day, we just learned it's not our responsibility to convert anybody, but it is our responsibility to compel them. It's our responsibility to compel everybody. I can't force anyone to follow Jesus, but I can live my life in a way that people are drawn to Jesus. So we say at Timberlake Church, we are show and tell church. We show people the love of Jesus with our actions, and then we use our mouth to tell them with our words. We don't have evangelism programs at our church, right? It's not like we go door to door and we're handing out flyers and all that. You know what we do? Our lives are the evangelism. We are the program. So I'll close with this. The Apostle Paul says, he writes about this and he says, for God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. And he gave us this wonderful message of reconciliation. So we are Christ's ambassadors. God is making his appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back to God. It's our job. So today is Volunteer Sunday, and just being candid with you, I'm not going to ask the question, who wants to attend a great church, because we all do. I do want to ask you, who wants to help build a great church? This can't be something that just burns in my heart or the heart of our staff. It has to burn in all of our hearts. It takes all of us linking arms to do what we do. And so if you are not currently on a volunteer team, very candidly, I'm gonna ask you to join one. You can indicate interest on a flyer that you were handed when you came in, and if you say, I wasn't handed one, then on your way out, you'll see them on tables. We have booths in our lobby that you can stop and ask questions to. You can pretend you're interested and just take candy and leave. There's a connection card that you can indicate interest. You can go online at timberlakechurch.com and you can click the tab that says Next Right Steps. You can go to the app and you can click on the word connect and go to Next Right Steps. But there's all sorts of ways to indicate interest. And I realize we all have different schedules. Some, we have a weekly availability, others bi-weekly, others is like once a month, there are others random throughout the year. But I want you to find an area that you say, I can do this, I can make this commitment. I'm gonna link arms with the rest of my church family and we're gonna help create a church in which people are able to find and follow Jesus. Create a church where grace and truth are seen, where we're committed to the uncommitted. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, I thank you for Timberlake Church, what you've done in and through us over the years. And I pray for a renewed focus, a renewed passion, a renewed excitement among us. Help us to stay the course. Help us to not drift from our mission. We need your help desperately. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you. Thank you for being here today. We are done being the church in here. Now let's go be the church out there. We'll see you.
Thanks for watching. But before you go, please be sure to bookmark this page so that you can find us again next week. And are you looking for a way to get engaged and join a team? The online chat engagement team is a role that anyone and everyone can do, and it's simple. Engage with people, create an environment where people are free to be themselves, and more importantly, open to receive the truth of Jesus. And if you're interested in joining this team and becoming part of what God is doing through Timberlake Online, please let me know on your connection card. Links can be found in chat, and I'll see you here next week at online.timberlakechurch.com.